Okay, and I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Brendan Mahan, who is an ADHD and executive function coach. He's also the owner and founder of ADHD Essentials and the ADHD Essentials podcast. Brendan, I really want to thank you for being with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, Justin.
I know from talking to you before that your history as an educator, your many years of history of teaching children, as well as now your many years of experience as a coach, have really shaped your view on ADHD and also the methods that you now use for addressing ADHD. And I just want to know if you could speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, well, some of it is teaching is at its core communication, right? So my career as an educator really taught me how to be a more effective communicator. And specifically, I was an English teacher. So then I get to not just communicate effectively verbally, but also in writing. And I'm assessing kids' writings and getting an even more clear understanding of that. So some of how it shaped me is I'm just a much more effective communicator than I probably would otherwise have been. The other piece is, as a teacher, I taught sixth grade English. And in sixth grade, you're typically getting kids from lots of different schools who are being thrown in your lap because you're the first year of middle school. Sometimes it's fifth grade, but usually it's sixth. And so I would have kids coming from not just different teachers, but different school buildings. So their ability level varied wildly. Before we even get to ADHD, I've got kids who their fifth grade teacher was an amazing writing teacher or reading teacher. And other kids who had a fifth grade teacher who might have been an amazing math teacher, but was kind of crummy when it came to the English language and those sorts of skills. So from the jump, I've got kids with vastly different skill sets that I have to sort of help navigate. Also, middle school kids are all over the map anyway, because some of them are like 12 feet tall and look like they're 50, and others of them are 3 feet tall and look like they're 10. So I had to get comfortable with varying my delivery and recognizing the kids are in different places and scaffolding them to where I need them to be, which is a teaching term for if the kid isn't where you need them to be, you figure out where they are and then meet them where they are with challenges and skill building to help get them to where you need them to be by the end of the year. It's not perfect. You don't always pull it off, but usually you get them at least close, if not to where you need them to be or beyond. And so when it comes to ADHD, understanding how to scaffold and how to get kids where they need to be means I can help parents get to where they need to be. I can help kids get to where they need to be. I can help adults that I work with get to where they need to be, regardless of what their struggles are, because ADHD is a developmental disorder. And I like to call it life on hard mode. Like we're all challenged and struggling in a given area. And with ADHD, it's often not the same area, right? Like you might be great at regulating your emotions and terrible at organizing things. And someone else might be horrible with time, but pretty good at being organized and about average for managing their emotions. So being able to assess where people are at and then being able to meet them where they are and get them to where they want to be, all of those skills come from my time as a teacher. And the other piece that is critical, that it plays into my podcasting, it plays into my speaking engagements, it plays into my coaching, both for my parent groups and one-on-one, is like I taught middle school English, right? I was teaching 12-year-olds how to read and write and how to care about reading and writing and how to do it better than they used to do it. And if you don't get buy-in, like you can't teach anybody. So if I can get 11 and 12-year-olds to buy into Tuck Everlasting or Holes, I can get, well, those are two books, by the way, I can get anybody to buy into anything.
That's great. That makes a lot of sense to me. And so in addition to your experience as an educator, now you've been a coach, for so many years. I know your podcast has well over 100 episodes.
Going on 200.
Going on 200. I wonder, how has your view of ADHD changed in your time as a coach? How has it evolved?
That's a really good question. I don't think I've ever been asked that question before. That's awesome. Some of it is it's gotten more nuanced. right? Like as I learn more and understand more, that happened. When I started, I was like, had the perspective that lots of people have, right? When I was a teacher and things like I didn't know what executive functioning was. I didn't understand that it was a piece of ADHD. I had that view of like, oh, that kid can't pay attention. That's cool. I can't either. That kid's impulsive. That's cool. I am too, right? Because I have ADHD. And then I learned about the role that time plays in it and the nature of emotional regulation and all this kind of stuff. And I was ahead of the curve on the role that emotions were playing in ADHD. I was talking about that stuff before all the cool kids were, but I wasn't a name at the time. I was like some dude who was trying to get his head into the ADHD world and was thinking about leaving education, right? And then Thomas Brown, I think, Smart But Stuck, that book came out about a year after I started making a deal out of it. And it was really the first book that made a big deal about emotions. And since then, it's taken off, of course. But that's always been my lens is emotions. But it sort of started at like, well, here's the problem. Here's the problem. Right. And then as time went by, I was like, oh, I should probably figure out what the solutions are. Like that's what people really want. They don't just want to know what the problem is. Because that's kind of how my brain works. I'm like, oh, what's the problem? Oh, cool. If I know what the problem is, then I can figure out the solution. But not everybody thinks like I do. Some people are like, that's great. Now that I know what the problem is, I feel more overwhelmed. I'm like, oh, here's the solutions, right? So a lot of what I do and where I've gone is like tips and tricks and hacks and stuff are all well and good. They have their place. They're valuable. They're important. They're significant. Everybody who's talking about those things on this summit, they matter. But you can't do anything with tips and tricks and hacks until you've got your emotions nailed down, until you are able to navigate the tumultuous world of ADHD in a way that allows you to get to those tips and tricks. And a lot of that comes down to compassion and acceptance, right? Like you got to accept that you have ADHD. If you don't accept it, you're not going to get as far as you could. And I've got people who are like, no, I'm totally cool with executive function and I totally have an ADHD friendly life. And I'll say to them, cool. So like, how are your clothes going? And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, you put them away? And they're like, well, I mean, sort of. Like, do you ever just live out of a laundry basket? Like you just don't even put them away. You just leave your clothes in the laundry basket. And they're like, yeah. And I go, that's totally fine, right? Like that's completely acceptable. And it's absolutely a neurodiverse accommodation that is totally valid, even though most people don't do that. And it's like this stunning revelation to a lot of people who think they've accepted their ADHD, but can't accept that they could just not fold their laundry as long as it looks okay, right? But also can't seem to fold their laundry. Like they struggle with that. It's a thing that's really hard for them, but they have all this shame that they live out of a laundry basket. And I'm like, you don't need to carry that shame. You can just live out of a laundry basket because you've been doing it for the past 5 years and no one's complained about it. No one seems to care. So why do you care? Just do that. And that's what I mean about acceptance. That's what I mean about compassion, in this case, self-compassion, right? Like if you're doing something and it's not ruining your life and it works and it makes life easier, keep doing it.
That's great. And that actually leads into my next question really well, because I know in addition to compassion, you talk a lot about the importance of connection. And I wonder if you could kind of tell me a little more about that and expand on how you work the importance of connection.
That the connection stuff comes up, especially with my parenting work, because the conflict at home. And so I have these online parent coach. Bleh. So I have these online parent coaching groups that I run. And they're called ADHD parenting groups, but ADHD is like secondary. The primary things that I'm attacking are anxiety and interfamily relationships or intra-family relationships, right? So connection. How connected are the parents to each other? How connected are the parents to the kids? How connected are the kids to the kids? That's where the rubber meets the road for effective ADHD management. That's the stuff that like greases the wheels of being able to do what you need to do. If we are connected, if we are responding to each other's bids and paying attention and and caring about each other and accepting each other and loving each other unconditionally, the conflict is reduced. I'm not going to say it goes away because that's not real, but it's lessened. And when it happens, it's not as pronounced. It's not as intense because we know everyone is coming from a perspective of we're all doing the best we can. We all want to succeed and we all love each other. And if we're not doing the best we can and we're not succeeding, it's because there's some kind of skill that's missing. And so we need to find out what that is and then help each other through that. And this team perspective, this connected perspective is what helps things go more smoothly. And when, as parents, we make it a point to connect with our kids, even when it's hard, even when they're like a little resistant, it might not like, we might not see the benefit of that today, but tomorrow, a week from now, it's going to make things go a little more gently. And the more we connect, the gentler things will be. I can't say enough about how important and how critical it is. And it's funny the kinds of things that can undermine connection, right? Like back before COVID hit, so I don't know, 2 years ago, my kids and I were on a rafting trip or a tubing trip. We were tubing down a river. And it was one of those, like, you know, when you're in a different spot and you just talk about stuff you wouldn't otherwise bring up. It was one of those moments. So my guys are probably, I have identical twin sons who are 10 years old or are 12 years old. Sorry. 10 at the time. Maybe even 9. And they go, Gavin says to me, he goes, Dad, I feel like you just aren't making time for us. I feel like you don't want to spend time with us this summer. And I was floored because I was carving out time in my schedule as much as I could, trying to make sure the business stays afloat. I can't just shut down the business for the summer. But I was carving out all kinds of space for them to hang out with them. We went on a tubing trip for the whole day. But that time that I was carving out, I didn't communicate it to them. I didn't tell them when those times were. And it was wildly inconsistent. It wasn't like every day at 4:00 we hung out. Sometimes it was 4, sometimes it was 9 in the morning. Sometimes it was, we're going out to lunch. Other times we're grabbing dinner or ice cream in the evening. It was all over the map. So it felt chaotic and they couldn't see the pattern. So they didn't think I was making time for them, even though I was. And sometimes that's what undermines our connection is one person is making all this effort. The other person can't see it. So the other person feels disconnected because they can't see the effort because the first person didn't communicate it. And then the first person who is making all this effort doesn't feel like their effort is being acknowledged or validated. So they're like, well, why am I doing this if you don't even care? And they give up. But if we can communicate more effectively with one another, it's going to go more smoothly. We're going to have more connection because we'll understand that the effort is there. And the other piece of this that is critical for everyone to understand is it kind of drives me crazy when people say, oh, that person just wants attention, right? Like they're just attention seeking. No, they're not. No one is attention seeking. They're connecting. They're seeking connection. But the only way to get connection is to first get attention. So you end up seeking attention when what you really need is connection. Attention feels frivolous and silly. Connection is like a deep, important need. And so reframing that thought of, oh, they're just seeking attention all the time into that person, kid or adult, needs connection and is feeling lonely or like rejected. If we can make that reframe, it becomes easier and also more important for us to connect with whoever that person is.
That's great. And it's something that can benefit every family, not just an ADHD family.
Right.
You brought up your parent groups. I wanted to ask you more about that, about just the format and what parents can expect to get from those.
Yeah. So we meet for 8 weeks. I won't go into like crazy details of times and stuff, but we meet for 8 weeks on Mondays and on Wednesdays for an hour each day. I do hang out for an extra 15 minutes, like a bonus round kind of after school program thing that happens, but that's not mandatory. If you got to go back to work, you got to go back to work. I try to be really respectful of people's time. But we meet for an hour twice a week. There's a morning, like an afternoon session and an evening session. And we meet over the course of 8 weeks. Each of the 8 weeks has its own theme, and the themes in order, at least at the moment, unless I start messing with stuff again, The themes are, we start with self-care because during COVID, everyone had to start with self-care. So that's just where we start now. It's important. It gets us balanced. It gets us centered. Then we shift into parenting as leadership because parents are leaders, but no one tells us that. So we don't always think of ourselves as leaders, and it's important that we do. So we start looking at parenting as leadership. That's things like, what are your values? That's things like, what's the difference between a boss and a leader? It's that kind of stuff. Week 3 is connection. Just like I was just talking about, we got to hit that. We got to get going with that. And then week 4 is communication, which is really sort of connection part 2, just looking at how you communicate instead of the other ways that we connect. Week 5 is systems and structures, which is really what most people with ADHD, especially early on, want. They want that, like, well, how do I do the thing? So week 5 is like, how do you do the thing, right? How do you get your kids out to school in the morning? How do you get them to bed at night? How do you make sure lunch is packed? How do you make sure their homework left the house or was submitted over the internet? That sort of thing. And also, how do you clean your house? That's in there too. Week 6 is anxiety, because anxiety is, I like to think of anxiety as like the best friend of ADHD that causes a lot of trouble. And like ADHD is like, I love you, anxiety. You're the best. And anxiety is like, I don't really care. It's nice that you like me, but I'm a narcissist and I want everyone to pay attention to me. And I'm a supervillain. I want to take over the world. So we look at sort of, how does anxiety play a role in making our ADHD worse? How does it play a role in severing connection and causing more conflict at home? And how do we navigate it? How do we reduce that anxiety and get rid of it? Again, not perfect. I'm not a magic bullet. I'm not saying we're getting rid of all of the anxiety, but we want to reduce it. And then week 7 is the wall of awful, which is my model for the emotional impact of ADHD, that we can talk about if you want to. There's like, I did a podcast episode on it. There's YouTube videos on how to ADHD. It's around. Anyone who's heard of me probably has heard of the wall of awful. And then week 8, which is our last week, is questions. And that is sort of me being a little bit tricky, right? On the one hand, yeah, we're going to talk about questions. How do you get your kid to say something other than good, fine, and nothing when you ask them about how their day went? How do we use questions to help develop and strengthen executive functions? But primarily the job of that week is, I'm not going to get to everything in 8 weeks. So although there's time for questions throughout the groups and every week 8 is like, bring me your stuff, like just stump me. Because there's some pretty significant ADHD topics that I didn't mention in those weeks, right? I didn't say anything about medication. I didn't say anything specific about school. And although that stuff comes up throughout the weeks, this is where I kind of open the door on that. I don't talk much about meds because I'm not a pharmacist and I'm not a doctor and I can't do that. Like, it's not my area of expertise. So I'm going to be like, talk to your pharmacist, talk to your prescriber. And I leave out school because it's so individual based on the school district. As much as people's individual home stuff is, that stuff is more similar than the challenges that people face at school, I've learned. So the school stuff is kind of like, I'm happy to help, but mostly we need to do a one-on-one consult to navigate that. Like, how do I get my kid's IEP to get accepted or whatever? So that's the groups. We meet over Zoom. I've had people from Egypt. I've had people from all over the United States and just all over the world. New Zealand, Australia, Egypt, England, primarily the United States and Canada, but every now and then we get a fun foreigner. And it's a blast. It's 50% connection, 50% content. So you're connecting with other parents that have ADHD. And that's for a lot of people, that's the most powerful part is, I don't feel alone anymore. Like, I'm not all by myself. And so I make it a point to make sure that that's happening as well.
Right. I think that's great. Just leveraging the power of support groups, as well as, just getting great information into the hands of parents.
Yeah, and that's where my past as a teacher comes in, right? Like, here's the content, soup to nuts, and you can understand it right away.
Right. You developed a curriculum essentially for it.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, and you did bring it up, the wall of awful. I know it's one of the things that you're really known for, and it's a barrier that a lot of ADHD people have to starting new things. And I was wondering if you could I think it is brilliant. I wonder if you could go into it a little more.
Thank you. The wall of awful is the emotional impact that prevents us from taking risks and initiating tasks. everyone has a wall of awful, not just ADHD folks, because we all fail, right? And that's how the wall of awful gets built. Like you fail, you get a little failure brick, and your wall is beginning to get built. Along with the failure brick, you get a disappointment brick because you disappointed yourself, but you also disappointed other people. So we get bricks for the people in our lives who might be disappointed based on our failure. That could be mom or dad or a teacher. That could be your boss, your spouse, your kid, your brother or sister, your best friend. It could be anybody, coworker. And then we get rejection bricks for the people that we disappointed because we assume they're going to reject us. We also are assuming that we disappointed them. We might not have, but we're assuming that we did. And so we get this brick regardless of what the other person says. Sometimes if they get in there quick enough, they can kind of loosen the brick up or keep it from staying, metaphorically speaking. But usually it kind of sticks because we know we disappointed them way before they can say it's not a big deal. And as time goes by and we fail more and in different ways, we get other bricks, right? So you might get anxiety, you might get shame, you might get guilt or fear. And I want to split guilt and shame really quick. Guilt is I feel like I made a mistake. Shame is I feel like I am the mistake. And when the reason you made the mistake is because you have ADHD, it's really easy for guilt to become shame. In fact, there's people out there who talk about this model and call it the wall of shame because they didn't remember the real name, because it's so prominently featured in this concept. And that's what a lot of people feel when they start hearing about it. They're like, oh man, right? It's hard. It's no joke that all of these negative emotions are there, and they're there because we failed so much. But you don't have a wall of awful for everything. There's stuff like I can go speak in front of an audience of 500 people, and it's not a big deal. Not everybody can do that. Lots of people get a little anxious because that's a hard thing for them. It's not hard for me, but ask me to respond to email and I'm going to struggle, right? Like there, I have a wall of awful. So we all have different walls of awful. And sometimes walls of awful combine to make things more difficult, right? Like if I need to lose weight, and I do thanks to COVID, I have to get past some walls of awful around body image. I have to get past some walls of awful around feeling guilty that I couldn't organize myself and sort of schedule myself effectively enough to exercise. And I couldn't do that before, but now I have to. Like, what's that about? I have to get past walls of awful for like eating and my diet and motivation. There's a lot of walls of awful wrapped up in trying to lose weight. That's why it's so hard, because there's so many barriers to get past. And at any moment, you can feel like you're past all of them, and then another one can show up that you thought you had moved beyond. The same is true for things like dating and getting back out there, as folks would say. Every time you try to ask someone out, there's echoes of every person you've ever asked out for a date in that ask. And if you're asking someone, unless you're polyamorous, odds are those other relationships fizzled out or failed or didn't work. So that's a lot of failure to have to navigate, as well as like all the people who shot you down, because there's echoes of those in the ask too. And those are some of the ways to look at the wall of awful as a phenomenon. And it's like I said, I don't want to just name the problem and not share solutions. So there's 5 ways to get past the wall of awful. 2 don't work, 1 works but is unhealthy, and 2 work. So the 2 that don't work are staring at it and trying to go around it, right? Sometimes you're just stuck and you're like, that's a really big wall, and you're staring at it, but you're not doing anything with it. You're not engaging with it. So you're not going to go around, you're not going to get past it. And then other times we're like, oh man, I have to like send these emails, but first I'm going to watch an episode of Bob's Burgers and then I'll do it. And you might mean it. You might be like, yeah, that'll help me kind of feel better about life. And then I'll be able to check my email. But 1 episode becomes 2, which becomes 3, which becomes 4. And maybe you didn't really mean it, or maybe you did. I don't know, but you didn't do your emails. You watch Bob's Burgers. So that those 2 are not effective and actually add bricks because they're failures, right? I didn't engage. The one that gets us past it but isn't healthy is smashing the wall. Because sometimes we just get mad and use that to motivate ourselves, right? You're fine, I'll do the dishes. God, it's okay, I'll go grocery shopping, right? Or you turn it inward and you're like, why do I suck so much? Why can't I just do my homework? Why can't I just check my email? Why can't I just pay my taxes, right? Like, what's wrong with me? So the smashing can be outward, where you're snapping at somebody, or inward, where you're kind of beating yourself up. In both cases, we're damaging relationships. We're either hurting our relationship with ourselves or our relationship with whoever we're snapping at. The two that work to get past it, the first one is climbing it, which is becoming aware of your walls of awful, accepting that they exist, accepting that there's this emotional hurdle you need to get past, navigating those emotions, and then moving beyond the wall. That's really hard and takes a long time. Things like meditation help with that. Things like counseling and coaching work can help with that. A lot of introspection can help with that, but it's a long-term strategy. It's healthy because you become a stronger climber by doing that. You get better at it. And also you can come up with ADHD strategies to help you climb more effectively, right? So that's where the timers and your calendars and all that kind of stuff, that's sticky notes. That's where those things become useful because they help us climb faster. Even just realizing that we're climbing the wall makes the climb go more easily because we know what's happening. The other option to get past the wall, which is faster, it's a really good short-term fix, but doesn't help in the long term and can sometimes make things even harder in the long term if we only ever do the short-term fix, is putting a door in it. And that's really just changing your emotional state. That's what that is, because the wall of awful is made of emotions. Just like smashing your way through is using anger to change your emotional state so you can power through this emotional barrier. You can also listen to music that makes you feel motivated, right? Like if you want to go to the gym, but you're not going, turn on the Eye of the Tiger, put on some Metallica, right? You're going to get going. You're going to feel motivated and want to go do the thing. Or as an entrepreneur, there's times when I'm like, I got to do this project. I got to like launch these coaching groups. I got to write this article. I got to do whatever, but I'm not feeling it. And I'll listen to podcasts or summits like this about either ADHD specific stuff or just people who are successful and are talking about being successful and doing successful things. That stuff inspires me and makes me feel motivated. And now I want to be successful. Going and working in another location, right? There's a reason people write in coffee shops because being somewhere else helps us get past the wall of awful. That's the whole idea behind like WeWork and the co-working spaces. And also exercise and movement can help you get past your wall. One, because physiologically it increases the dopamine in your brain, and let's ride that wave to get started. But also because it just gives us some momentum. We just feel like we did something, and I may as well keep doing something. So now that I've exercised, I'm going to go, I don't know, write a letter to my grandmother to thank her for my birthday present or something. But if you have a wall of awful for exercise, it might be tricky to do that. And honoring the nature of COVID, some folks might have a wall of awful for going to a coffee shop and going somewhere else, because a lot of us have been cooped up in our houses for well over a year now, and going somewhere else might be welcome and you might be jazzed about it, but you might also feel anxious about it. So even just going somewhere else in your own house might be helpful.
That's great. I really appreciate that. And I know that we're coming towards the end of our time, but I wanted to get a chance to ask you because even though you've talked about, tips and tricks as being, above and beyond a lot of the emotional work that you do, but I wanted to ask you, what are some of your, favorite tips and tricks? I know you talk a lot about the importance of rest and mindfulness and diet. What are some of the things that you think are most important?
Yeah, I'll do some big picture stuff and some small picture stuff, right? On the emotional land and the acceptance land, we all have that voice in our head that's kind of a jerk and tells us we suck or tells us we can't do that or whatever. I like to give that voice a name that is not your name, right? Like mine is named Zach. And when my voice is like, I'm like, thanks for your input, Zach, but I got this, right? Like so I can kind of think back at it or talk back at it instead of thinking of it as my voice, because it often isn't. It's often wrong. So that's one option, is kind of talk back to the voice in your head, give it a name so it depersonalizes it. I have this phrase that I use, which is sometimes the ADHD wins, which is because sometimes it does, right? Like sometimes I screw up because I have ADHD, and that's supposed to happen. This is all kind of one melange of tricks, right? One, accept that you have ADHD and accept that you're supposed to mess stuff up. I have asthma too, right? When I suddenly can't breathe, I don't get upset with myself for being too lazy and unmotivated to breathe or just not caring enough to breathe. And no one gets upset with me in that way either. But with ADHD, when you forget to do something or just can't seem to start, often we start saying, oh, he's lazy. He just doesn't care. He just doesn't think it matters, that kind of stuff. And that's not true, right? In the same way that I don't suddenly think breathing doesn't matter because I can't breathe, I also don't suddenly think that cleaning the house doesn't matter because I can't seem to clean the house. We, for those of you listening, have a neurological disorder. It's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's no different than having asthma. It just affects our brain instead of our lungs. And you're allowed to struggle and make mistakes and have ADHD. Forgive yourself. And when it happens, just go, sometimes the ADHD wins. Because when you say that, that battle is over and you might win the next one. And then you're in better shape. In terms of like specific sort of more nitty gritty strategies, one thing I like for email is if you get like a counter, like the kind of thing they have outside of a club when they're keeping track of how many people go into the club, or for COVID, how many people go into the grocery store. One of those counters is great for email. One of the things that I find is hard for me for email is that it feels really ethereal. I often send emails and like I don't hear back from people for a week or 2 weeks or 3 days or whatever. So I almost feel like I'm just shouting into the void and hoping something happens, right? It doesn't feel like I did anything. I can spend 2 hours responding to emails and not feel like I did anything and have nothing to show for my efforts. But with a counter, with a little click counter, I have something to show for my efforts because every time I reply to an email, click. And now the number went up. And when I'm done in 2 hours, I can look back at that and go, oh, I replied to 27 emails or however many it was. Go me, right? Look, I did a thing. And it just helps me get the emails done. Even the clicky sound of hitting the button makes me feel like, oh, I did something. Like it's a sensory feedback component that is also pretty good. And then another one is just a time timer, which is, I don't have a visual for you, obviously, but a time timer it's a timer that turns red as you as you set the timer. So if you set the timer for 30 minutes, the space from 30 to 20 to 10 to 1 to 0, that turns red in like a half circle. And then as the time goes down, the red slowly disappears until the alarm goes off. And it just makes time easier to process because I can look at that and go, oh man, there's almost no red. I don't have a lot of time left. Or I can say, wow, that's a lot of red. I'm probably doing okay. And it lets me process time without having to think as hard about it. And it also lets me process time in sort of an emotional manner, as opposed to like a clinical, oh, look at the digital clock manner. And that emotional piece is what I need as an ADHD person. I need to have the pressure or the relax of, oh, there's a lot of time or there's no time. So those are some suggestions that I would throw at people in terms of ways to tackle some of ADHD's common challenges.
That's all really great. Yeah, I really appreciate your insight, and I appreciate your unique perspective to ADHD, especially when it comes to the importance of emotions and connection, and the parent groups that you support. I think those are obviously helping people, helping change lives. I appreciate your time. I want to remind everybody that you can find Brendan, a link to Brendan's courses, to his coaching program, all on his page on our Summit website. And Brendan, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. It's been great to be here.